We've done some work on emotional diversity that finds that it's not having, primarily positive feelings and no negative feelings that predicts better psychological health. It's actually having a more diverse menu of emotions, which is a little counterintuitive to what our kind of societal values are, like pushing down negative emotions and amplifying positive. But in fact, life brings up all kinds of experiences, even in the course of a day. And we have different emotions for a reason, like they're built into our minds and bodies as humans to help us.
You just heard June Gruber from the University of Colorado Boulder in Boulder, Colorado. Garth interviewed June for episode 202 of Psych Sessions, Conversations about Teaching and Stuff.
We know you want to reach every student in your course, to help every student individually succeed. But how do you find out what each student wants and needs? Macmillan Learning's Achieve for Psychology offers a solution. Ask them. Achieve puts goal setting and reflection surveys in each course, where students share their aspirations, thoughts, and concerns about what they are trying to learn. Their responses help you tailor lessons and assignments and addresses both individual and class-wide needs. See for yourself. Go to macmillanlearning.com/psych sessions for an introductory tour today. Macmillan's Achieve for Psychology, engaging every student, supporting every instructor, setting the new standard for teaching and learning.
The Psych Sessions podcast is sponsored by STP. That is the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. That's APA Division 2. You can find them at teachpsych.org. The views or product endorsements expressed do not represent the views, support, or endorsements of STP. Psych Sessions is so grateful to have STP as a long-term supporter.
Hi folks, this is Garth, and I want to tell you about an intro psych book from Sumo Learning. That's SOOMO. The book is called Psychology in the Real World by author Jennifer Harper. Psychology in the Real World encourages students learning along the way by providing frequent formative assessments all aligned with APA's themes and learning outcomes from the Intro Psych Initiative, all tagged so you can track their progress on those outcomes. It's got LMS integration and auto-grading and supplements like slides and test questions and notes, and it's affordable at only $50. So check it out. Go to sumolearning.com, that's SOOMO learning.com, and get a preview of psychology in the real world. Hi, folks. I am here today with June Gruber, who is an associate professor in the Department of Psychological Science and Neuroscience at the University of Colorado Boulder. June, we have never really met each other in person, but we have now been online twice together for different events. And so thanks for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just as good as in person one time, online multiple times.
Absolutely. And I almost ran into you at RMPA this spring. I was hanging out with Carlise. Carlise was hanging out with you, and I couldn't quite make it happen. But I did hear you were you in the building, or did she come to you?
I was in the building. I was at RMPA. It was fantastic.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, it's my favorite regional conference, and I'm thinking about adopting it as my own because even though I have conferences up in the Pacific Northwest, like TIP Northwest, which is intro psych focused, there's just not that student energy. Did you have a regional conference that you adopted when you were an undergraduate or anything like that?
I didn't have the kind of local community student-centered conference that I think RMPA supports and why I love it. I went to a couple larger conferences in my subfield of clinical psychology and the broader kind of, APA conferences. But I really do think there's something unique about having something local, and that feels a little more kind of scalable for students, especially as a first entry point into the field.
Yeah, and you work with a lot of students, right?
I
I do.
mean, in your lab, right?
I love working with students. I get to work with undergraduates, post-bac students, kind of gaining research experience, and graduate students in our clinical PhD program.
All right. Well, I have a bunch of questions for you, and we will go in all kinds of different directions. We can go wherever we want, actually. It's our podcast. Let's do it. One of the things that I find absolutely fascinating about your research, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem to you have this clinical psych background, and then you have this sort of positive psych bent to you. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, I think I was fortunate to sort of be academically raised both by a mentor who was a clinical psychologist and one who was a positive emotions researcher. And I've loved being able to really blend those worlds together and kind of work at the intersection.
Oh, that's great. Tell us about your lab. Like, what kinds of cool things are you doing?
I love my lab. So my lab's called the Positive Emotion and Psychopathology Lab, or PEP Lab. And our primary focus is to really kind of explore the ways in which our positive feelings, from joy to excitement to compassion and gratitude, really manifest in psychological disorders, both for good and also times when those positive emotions may either be experienced too much or too little, but really trying to understand how positive feelings play a role in mental health.
And first of all, how long have you been running this lab with this agenda?
15 years now.
Okay.
The first 4 years were in the psychology department at Yale, and then our lab moved here to Boulder in 2014. So we've been here 10 years now.
Wow. And this is really cool because I think that the research and the papers that you're putting out probably have real world implications for people who are doing therapy out there in the world. So what is it like? How do you make that connection? Or is that the ultimate kind of goal for you, is to have the things that you're learning in your lab actually manifest in practice?
Absolutely. I mean, the way that I think about it when it comes to mental health, we want to learn things that both help us better understand the experiences of people. We study people with mood disorders, so depression, bipolar disorder. We want to understand what their experiences are like, but then use that understanding to really leverage it to better inform treatments. We have good treatments out there, but they're not perfect, and many people are still not being served or met with where their emotional needs are. So yeah, we think of the process as a stream, one step feeds into the other and it all kind of cycles together. So the more we understand, we can develop better treatments, and the treatments can point to areas that we still need to further understand. So it's that kind of bi-directional or back and forth between the lab and we say the clinic. We really want them to be talking to each other.
Yeah. Do you have a place where these things get put into practice? Are you connected with a clinic either on campus or outside of campus in Boulder?
So my department, I'm in the clinical psychology graduate program, and we do have an in-house clinic there that many of our graduate students will train in as well. But the way that I think about it is what we do isn't tied to perhaps any one particular clinic. But, as someone who's both, an experimental psychologist and a licensed clinical psychologist, we try to think about the studies you run in our lab. What can they tell us about the ways we can do a better job to help people harness positive emotions? We both, publish these in papers, try to give talks to raise awareness in the scientific community, in the public, and then try to think about ways we can pilot these in interventions. So, for example, helping people who are prone to mania, which is, this core piece of bipolar disorder. What are the ways that they're managing their emotions really well? And what are other ways that we can better help support them, especially when there's these intense moments of excitement?
Okay. So I want to know, can you give me an example of the type of research you would do in your lab with people who are coming in with these mood disorders?
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite?
Yes, but the favorite is many pieces. So one of the things I love about studying emotions is it isn't confined to any one way. Or any one way of studying it. So our emotions are things we feel subjectively. So we will always gather self-reports asking people to tell us how they feel. We'll also record their facial behavior on a camera. So then we can look at how to code muscle contractions in the face to see kind of what emotions they're displaying. And then we look at what's happening in their body. So we hook them up to non-invasive sensors to measure their heart rate, their breathing, their skin temperature. And what we're doing is we're measuring all of these three things concurrently. So we would bring someone into our lab to give you like a day in the life of a participant in our study. They would come into our lab. The first thing we would do is kind of sit down and do a in-depth clinical interview where we'll get more information about their mental health history, a sense of their clinical diagnoses, and right now, kind of what are their current levels of anxiety or depression or mania, kind of like what is their kind of past history and current mental health profile. And then we say, okay, we know more about you now. And we know whether you are someone who meets criteria for bipolar disorder or major depression or something else. And then we bring them into our lab. And it's fun in our lab. We sit them down on a chair, and we first kind of get them set up with our kind of non-invasive suite of psychophysiology sensors. So these are sensors that we put, on their rib cages and their chest and their arms and their hands. And we get to look at everything happening inside their body, from like how much are they sweating, kind of skin conductance, what used to be used as a lie detector test, but that's not actually what it is.
Yeah.
It just says kind of how much is your body's kind of fight or flight response, kicking in, their breathing, their heart rate. And while all these things are kind of being measured, we're doing things with them to kind of evoke emotions in a safe context. So we'll have people recall powerful emotional memories in their lives and then relive them, kind of reimagine them in their mind's eye. We'll have them look at images and watch these validated brief film clips that really evoke positive or negative feelings. And while they're doing it, we're measuring what's happening in their body. We're recording their facial expressions or having them periodically tell us what they're feeling. And we'll do this both like watching people's natural emotions. So when you just let people remember memories or watch emotional images, what naturally happens. And then in another condition, we'll ask them to follow specific instructions on how to regulate their emotions, whether it's cognitively reappraising them, using some mindfulness-based strategies, and look at, do their emotional responses change when they follow these cues? And in what way is that different or not from someone who, for example, doesn't have a history of any mood difficulties? A new study we're starting, we're also going to be bringing them into a fMRI scanner to try to understand like what is happening in their brain when they're experiencing emotions and trying to regulate them as well.
Wow. That sounds like a lot of fun. And I'm guessing participants are having enjoyable experiences. That's why they're coming back, right? Or that's why they're signing up. Yeah.
Yeah. And, it's really very humbling. Many of our participants will tell us that like the main reason they participate is they want to give back to science. They want to help shed insider information into, especially those with a history of mood difficulties. They want to help better understand for everyone in the field, what's happening. So they get a personal benefit, but also they want to give back.
Yeah. Just as an aside, how difficult is the human subject's approval for the research that you're doing? Is it something that is quite a barrier, or have you sort of figured it out over time?
I've found human subjects, both here in Boulder and at my previous institutions, to be really supportive. Importantly, though, we have many kind of safeguards in process, and we have informed consent. We let people know that if any time they're uncomfortable with any aspect of the procedure, they can stop. They can opt out if there's any questions they don't want to answer. So everything they're willingly consenting to, and if they're uncomfortable, we can stop at any point. And we also make sure that if anyone is experiencing any unanticipated distress, we stop, we check in with them. These things are rarely, if ever, invoked, but we make sure that we have a lot of safeguards in place and that the kinds of tasks we're doing are eliciting kind of safe, mild to moderate intensity feelings. So we don't ever want to do anything that would make anyone feel uncomfortable or put them in a place where they're having emotional experiences that are not manageable. So, but the ethics committees have been relatively supportive. We've been really lucky.
That's great. I asked that question largely for my students who I hope will listen to this because they're community college students, and a lot of them have aspirations to maybe work with clients someday and to do research. And so getting an idea of like how this actually works for them is really helpful. What are the major or some of the major takeaways that you are finding in your work? I mean, I'm sure there's moments where you're like, there's high fives going on because you found something really neat that you think is actually going to help people. What are some of those things?
Yeah, I can think of kind of several. Maybe there's kind of top 3 takeaways that we've learned working with individuals with mood history challenges, but it's lessons both for people who have lived experience of mania or depression, but there are also more general lessons for all of us who are human beings with strong emotions at times. I would say, of the top 3 takeaway lessons, the first one that I think is very important is that, positive emotions are not feelings we want to unconditionally try to maximize, sort of feel positive all the time at all costs. And I think especially in mainstream kind of US culture, there is this emphasis to like, I should feel happy. I should be trying to increase my positive emotions all the time. And if I'm not, there must be something wrong. In fact, we find that experiencing positive emotions too intensely, it can cause just as many challenges in our life as having negative emotions that are too intense. Like all emotions have a place and a time, and sometimes in moderation. So we find that when people have positive emotions that are very or extremely intense, they might be less likely to pay attention to details, especially they may be more likely to overlook potential risks in their environment. So they might be more likely to be risk-taking, not really paying attention to potential threats in their environment or cues of safety. They're also, I think this is really interesting, they're less likely to be able to empathically connect with others who come to them seeking support. We find that people who are very positive think they're really good at understanding other people. They believe they are. But when it comes to understanding other people, so if a friend comes to you sharing something challenging that happened to them, you actually may have a harder time kind of dropping down and really getting what they're going through.
I have this conversation with people sometimes because I am so fortunate to not experience a lot of sadness. It's just not one of the extreme emotions that I feel very often, or purposelessness or whatever. As a therapist, what you're saying to me is interesting for me to reflect on, because I do know that there are times in my personal life where I'm like, somebody is sharing something with me and I'm trained to know how to respond to this. And there's empathy, certainly. And yet it's hard sometimes for those who feel a lot of strong emotions, strong positive emotions pretty consistently. I sometimes wonder, like, am I able to connect with this person in my life who may have, be dealing with significant sadness that I'm not aware of? Now, is that different than what you're saying?
No, but I think you raise another point, which is I think another piece of this, which is that, this kind of second takeaway, we find that what we've done some work on emotional diversity that finds that it's not having, primarily positive feelings and no negative feelings that predicts better psychological health. It's actually having a more diverse menu of emotions, which is a little counterintuitive to what our kind of societal values are, like pushing down negative emotions and amplifying positive. But in fact, life brings up all kinds of experiences, even in the course of a day. And we have different emotions for a reason, like they're built into our minds and bodies as humans to help us. And so, there's a reason we have sadness and anger and frustration as much as we have joy and love and gratitude. And so we find that people who in their daily lives have more diverse emotions, a mix of positive and negative, actually report fewer symptoms of depression. They have better physical health outcomes. And so it kind of suggests that everyone has their own, mix of emotions. But as a general rule, we might want to strive for more diverse feelings in our everyday, which includes also sometimes embracing negative too.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. So I know you were talking about 3 things that you've learned, and we're still on the first thing, but I don't want to move on quite yet because I'm fascinated by this. So strong positive emotions, is there a lot of like cultural pressure in your estimation to experience positive emotions all the time? I mean, I really kind of understand that oftentimes that's what social media, some parts of social media are going for, right? But
yeah. Well, there's some really interesting cross-cultural work by Jeannie Tsai at Stanford, and we've been lucky to collaborate with her in my lab, that shows that more Western individualistic communities, cultures, countries tend to highly value and prioritize what we call these high arousal positive emotions, excitement, joy, kind of these high energy positive states. Whereas more collectivistic Eastern cultures tend to place a higher cultural premium on average for more what they call low arousal positive states, serenity, calmness, contentment. So on the one hand, yes, there is a general cultural kind of emphasis, and you could ask pressure on like having these like, I'm excited, I'm great, I'm good. And I think you're right that social media can amplify those in unhealthy ways and paint unrealistic portrayals of those emotions in our lives. But that being said, I do think there's antidotes to this as well. And I think there's also, a rising popularity in contemplative practices that kind of counterbalance that. And, these mindfulness kind of acceptance-oriented strategies we're seeing become more and more part of mainstream culture that's about accepting your emotions, right? And just letting yourself experience them. So I think there is still pressure, but there's also, other kind of buffering factors we see. But when I talk to students here on campus, both in my lab or my classes, and just sort of ask them, like, what is the general kind of emotional social pressure you think students feel or face? They will say they feel this sometimes pressure to smile, pressure to look happy on the outside.
My wife, well, we spend a lot of time in Southeast Asia, so it's so strange with our kind of Western emotional mentalities going over there because we just realize how different we are in the way that we express ourselves compared to, for example, our Thai friends. But this reminds me of my wife used to live in Germany, and and one time, I think it was like a host parent or something had asked her, like, why are you smiling? Why do you smile all the time? Now that might just be a German American thing, but it's an interesting reflection to say, like, how much of this is just built into the culture and the pressure to be a certain way. I mean, if I'm going to go to a job interview, if I'm a student, I'm going to a job interview, I'm going to try to look positive and put on my best, right? However we classify that. Yeah.
It's so interesting. One of my colleagues, wonderful researcher, Yulia Chentsova-Dutton, was doing some research in Russia and was sharing how it's some similarities or kind of parallels to what you're saying, where the kind of perception of these like outward displays of like excitement or like this big smile on the face are perceived very differently there. Right. And it's not the prioritized emotion in the same way it may be in the US for some people. So it does suggest, and there's some really cool research and writings about that culture really shapes not what we feel, but the kind of what we call display rules, like what we think in society we should be showing, and the values about what emotions are important and what should we be striving for.
I know you make this connection between your lab and then clinical. And like this is, I hope for anybody who is a licensed therapist out there right now, you're listening to this and it's helping us. I could think about like working with clients who are not from our culture. I mean, sometimes we know, like we're trained in how to work cross-culturally. At the best of times, we're trained in it. And yet there's all this nuance into exactly like what are the differences, and who would have thought that emotions are different from, you know, Germany and Russia to Thailand to there. It's not always as obvious, from, a European country to, United States or something like that, but it's in play.
Absolutely. There's a couple thoughts it reminds me in the kind of clinical setting is one, we talk a lot about how, early on when you're working with a new client, before you start asking them what they're feeling, to ask them about like, what are their emotional values? Like, what do they want to feel? What's important to them to feel? And how has that been shaped by their upbringing, right? Because you don't want to walk in having made assumptions, even not realizing it. The second part is it reminds me, related to this, Jeannie Tsai, who I mentioned earlier, had done some really compelling work looking at kind of, as I mentioned, like what people want to feel, but also found that when you looked at the kinds of emotions people displayed in their faces, kind of European American compared to Asian and Asian American participants displayed more positive emotion kind of outwardly. And so she talked about clinical implications where sometimes people may misperceive people from different cultural backgrounds. Some of the work she did among Asian and Asian American individuals, that a lack of as much outward express positive emotion, it doesn't reflect feeling less positive. There's just different cultural norms around that. And that sometimes clinicians may misdiagnose that person as feeling even depressed because they're not displaying it in their face, when that's sort of I'm trying to say this graciously, but like kind of making cultural assumptions about others that, that just aren't true. And so we do need to be really mindful and not make assumptions about what people display or say they feel, because you want to know first, like, what are their own values and what are the values of the cultural context that they were raised in or kind of ascribed to.
The measures that you do with, talk about the facial, the muscle kind of measurements that you do, and what can you learn from that? Because now I'm fascinated by this cross-cultural piece. Are there things that are, that kind of exist in spite of culture in terms of like facial and muscle movement in response to mood?
Well, it's interesting because the facial movement, we use what's called the facial action coding system that was developed by Paul Ekman. And so it takes a long time to train on it, 80 to 100 hours. You have to take a certification test. And the goal is to learn how to code these really subtle muscle contractions in the face. So you can try to remove yourself from these biases we have, and we just, we're humans. We look at people's faces and we read their emotions. It's sort of what we do. And this coding system is to try to help you take a step back and just learn about like coding one muscle contraction at a time, and then offline putting those together to say, do they fit into like an emotion prototype display, and then assign an intensity to it. So it tries to be a more objective way of coding the face. I think it's interesting because on the one hand, it's a way of coding that can make you less biased as a rater. That being said, like what's shaping the emotions people show in their face, certainly they're shaped by cultural display rules. They're shaped by what the person does and doesn't feel comfortable expressing in the context they're in, right? Mm-hmm. But sometimes what's kind of interesting is you can, even if people are trying to suppress an emotion on their face, you can still find these little subtle micro expressions that may pop up that may not always be observable to the like untrained eye, I guess. So I think it's pretty neat in that sense, that we can really try to see what's happening in people's faces. But what shapes it is kind of a different question, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I took us off course. You were telling me about three sorts of things that you have learned. What's the second one?
Well, the second one is about context and about context sensitivity. It's kind of linked to the first, meaning like not every context is one in which we should or ought to feel positive. And so it's related to the first, that's about intensity and like only feeling positive emotions. And the second is saying there's a time and place for feeling good, right? Like you're pursuing a goal that's really important to you. You just achieve something meaningful. You're connecting with a friend. All of those are wonderful, rich opportunities, but we find that people who have persistent positive emotions in contexts where it doesn't quite fit. So feeling positive when watching a film clip we have in our lab of a young boy crying over his father's death, or feeling really positive when a friend comes and shares with you one of the worst life events they've ever had. Okay. Or we've shown films of, these disgust eliciting films, which I'm not very good at watching because I'm very sensitive, but like feeling thrilled at this. We could think of other contexts, but we find like people who kind of can't shift down their positive emotions to match the context. They tend to we find at greater risk for certain mood difficulties like mania, where there's just positive emotions kind of stay in high gear across context, and they miss out on opportunities to really process what's happening and respond flexibly. So just saying like there's a time and place to feel positive, and it need not be all the time. I remember at the kind of beginning of the pandemic, when we were kind of having conversations about this literature, I said, it's appropriate to feel anxious. It's appropriate to feel frustrated, right? And angry at the kind of social injustices that were happening and continue to happen. To even feel positive in this time might mean you're out of touch with, the world and what's happening. And so just that's kind of the second theme. And the third one is some of our work with one of my wonderful collaborator, Iris Mouse at Berkeley and Brett Ford at Toronto, where we look at the values people have around happiness and find that the more people want to be happy and try to be happy and say they're putting a lot of energy into pursuing happiness, it's called the paradoxical pursuit because it backfires. And so the more we want to be happy and try, like have that emotion as our goal, like being happy, we set ourselves up to feel less happy. And actually, there's some work we found clinically that people are at greater risk of feeling more depressed, more anxious, even at greater risk for bipolar disorder. So the third is like finding happiness isn't really about trying. And actually, the more you try, you may set yourself up to be less happy. So not making the experience of positive emotions be your goal.
I'm silently with my mouth wowing while you're talking, right? This is so counterintuitive. I mean, I was just reading something on student studying, which just said, if you want to study better, have a goal in mind, right? I mean, so much research in different areas says set the goal and you will be more likely to achieve your goal. That is not the case here.
No, it's kind of the way that I think you have to think about it is like, the emotions are kind of like incidental, like find things that are meaningful to you and those positive feelings will follow. But if it's like, I don't care what I do or who I do it with, I just want to be happy, right? That's where we kind of set ourselves up to fail when we focus so much on the outcome, the feeling itself, as opposed to thinking about what are the choices I'm making? What are the activities I'm choosing to do? What are the, major I want to, undertake in college? It shouldn't be because we think it's going to make us happy. We have to look more for things that are meaningful to us, that have purpose, that connect us with others. Those are things that are going to predict happiness. But you have to not look at happiness as the end goal itself. It is kind of counterintuitive. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing some thinking about this. I won't process it all with you, even though you're my therapist now. But so I do want to get into, sometimes what we do is get into folks' backstory and just kind of figure out who they are and where they came from. And I know where I'm ending today. I know where we're going. So we can take any kind of turns we want to get there. And everybody will have to stay tuned to figure out where I'm going. But where did you grow up, first of all, and then we'll kind of build to how you got here.
Yeah, I grew up in a small town called Half Moon Bay. That is in California. It's between San Francisco and Santa Cruz. So I got to be lucky growing up next to the ocean, and in a very kind of peaceful small town. That's where I spent most of my life growing up. And then there was one period my family moved away. We came back, but we moved away for about 4 or 5 years to a tiny small town of 400 people in the middle of the redwoods up near Oregon. So
wow,
kind of been in nature a lot in different ways. And I've been really grateful for that.
Yeah. And now in Boulder, which is, similar theme. Half Moon Bay is, well, I mean, if folks don't know, you should go visit in California. It's gorgeous. And it's just like a really neat little place. What kind of industry were your folks in, or what did they do in Half Moon Bay?
Yeah. So my family, I'm an only child in my family. Pretty just humble origin. My dad was a salesman and my mom was a travel agent back when we had travel agents. It was a kind of family business she took over. And both very supportive and very much, you do you. Whatever grades you get in school are fine, as long as you're doing something you feel good about. So I was lucky. I think the going to college and beyond that was not really something that was, a huge emphasis in my family. But they were always just very supportive. So I feel really lucky.
Had they gone to college?
My mom took a class or two in community college, and my dad, he went to a local state school and studied economics. Yeah.
Okay. So he studied economics and then went into sales. Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So you grow up there. Where do you graduate high school? Are you up in your Oregon at this point?
We came back.
Oh, you came back. Okay.
Yeah. My family effectively, there was very few jobs up there. And so we came back.
At what point did you realize that you were going to college? Like this was something in your future?
I didn't really know or really think about it probably until my senior year when I had classmates and some teachers that talked about the college application process. And even then, I don't think I really knew where I was going to go. I knew at the time my family didn't have enough money to send me to college. We were sort of, collectively, my family's income was less than that of a single student's college tuition. So, what I did was I just kind of applied everywhere I could, tried to apply for a lot of scholarships, FAFSA, everything I could. And community state colleges, the University of California system, and just tried everything I could to see if I could make it work. Just because the financial piece was way out of my family's league. And then so I applied to all the UC systems, they call it. There was a single application, and I just kind of clicked all of those and applied to a bunch of local community colleges and state schools. And then I got really, 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 really lucky, very unexpectedly, and got a full scholarship to go to Berkeley. So I was able to go to college and, in a way that, my family couldn't afford to do. So I felt really
so you're going down the list, you're checking all these boxes for these places because, and it's a little bit out of, I'm going to I'll project on my experience, but it's a little naivety, right? Where it's like, I haven't been to these places. I don't even know what they are. Okay. You're agreeing with
I had no idea. I had no idea.
What about Berkeley? Did you know of Berkeley?
I mean, I had heard the name, but
Yeah.
I didn't. I mean, I'd heard it and I knew it was a good school, but no, I didn't know anything more. And I certainly didn't know, I didn't even think to apply out of state. Like that was just not on my radar of like things people, but I mean, I felt really lucky. California has a lot of great schools. So
Right.
yeah.
Well, one of the things we talk to students about is, well, especially first generation students, I talk to them about, the hidden curriculum. I talk to them about not knowing what they don't know. It sounds like you and I are maybe in that same sort of boat. Now, you did have a high school. It sounds like somebody at your high school was talking about college applications. So that's great that you had that.
I had a great English teacher who read my essays also. And my parents looked at them too. I mean, I had people looking at stuff, but I don't really remember having like a college prep counselor or what, nothing like that. I didn't know what an SAT was or ACT. We took something in high school, whatever they called the PSAT. And then I knew, I'll have to take this test. But I didn't do great on it. I had no, I had no familiarity with what it was,
So you didn't study for it, and
I studied, but I didn't. I didn't know. I looked at practice books, but no, it's there's this whole prep schools and agendas and socioeconomic status. I think that shapes a lot of those too. I just signed up, took it, looked at some things that I had gotten from my teachers, but beyond that, I mean, I really went into a completely naive, open-eyed.
How was your, you applied to a lot of schools. Did you get a lot of acceptance?
I did.
Yeah.
I did. Yeah.
And what was that? Was that grades related? Was it something else? Yeah. Grades.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's great. Okay. So how did you choose Berkeley? Like, when did you realize like, oh, this is a little different than maybe some of these other acceptance letters?
I remember getting the letter and being very excited. I was accepted initially, but then, at first realizing I probably couldn't go, because of, financial aid. So then I felt a little disappointed. And then a week or two later, I got this call saying that I was must have been on grades or my essay, that I was in a small group of, finalists, and would I interview for what they called this Regents and Chancellor Scholarship. And so I had no idea what an interview was, but I got a phone call and chatted with someone for an hour on the phone just about the books I was reading or the things I was interested in. And then a week later, I got this notification I had gotten this scholarship that would pay for the dorms and going to school. And
wow,
it's a dream. So then I was like,
cool.
Cool, and this great opportunity. So I felt just, blown away. Yeah.
At what point when you got there, did you decide on a psychology major?
I don't know. I mean, I really loved, I thought people were fascinating. But I took English, I took a lot of philosophy classes, I took psychology my first year. And I felt like what I really loved about psychology is it kind of blended a lot of everything. Like you got to, if you like to write, there's opportunities to write. If you liked kind of math, quantitative stuff, there was this really cool way to look at data and collect it and analyze it. If you're interested in the brain and biology, there was a place for that. It felt like this really unique topic where you could have such a diversity of things you do and skills you get to play with. Part of why I study emotions now, like we get to code narrative data of people's language and look at their brains. Like it's so diverse and there's so many things you can study and so many tools, and how much cooler of a thing than understanding people is there? I thought that was just so fascinating.
Did you get some of those experiences at Berkeley? Like, were you working in a lab eventually? And
my second year of college, I was walking around the hallways of the psychology department, going to office hours or something, and I saw like this bulletin board with flyers, and it was like different professors put these flyers up for research opportunities. And I really didn't know what that meant, but I thought it sounded pretty cool. And there was this one flyer that said like studying emotions in schizophrenia. And I thought, I don't know what that means, but that sounds really cool. So I emailed the professor who was anchoring, and she emailed me back and asked if I could come to an interview. And she was amazing. And she was one of those mentors that in a big, Berkeley's a really big campus, and most of my psychology courses had 200 or 300 students in them. So it was really easy to kind of, feel shy or kind of get lost, if you weren't sort of someone who felt bold enough to go up to your professor at the end of class. And so she took me under her wing, and like me and another student who's still a friend of mine, who's now a professor at Irvine, Jessie Borelli, she took us both in as her undergrad research assistants, and just like, she showed us how everything worked and gave us all these opportunities to be in research. And I owe like so much to her. I wouldn't have probably gone this path if I didn't have that mentor that, looked out for me and took me in under her wing quite young, so to speak, as a student.
Amazing that you're walking down the hallway and there's probably many opportunities, but emotion captures you somehow, something in you. And then of course, now we know the story at the end, which is like you end up studying emotion and mental health or disorders, right? So, okay. So at that point, you get this great undergraduate experience with this great mentor. And then it's time to decide about grad school. So how do you approach it this time?
Yeah. My friend Jessie, who was in the same lab, was a year ahead of me. And so when I was in my third year of college, she was applying, and sort of like a friend and kind of older sibling, she told me what she was doing, and kind of like I got to kind of ask her a bunch of questions as she's writing her essays or going on interviews, things like that, and really learned a lot through having basically a peer mentor, really, who kind of told you the ins and outs of the whole process. That in the lab I was working in, I stayed in Anchoring's lab as an undergrad for 3 years, sophomore through my last year of college. I also had a wonderful group of grad students that, they told me what it was like. One of them loaned me an outfit to wear when I was interviewing, because I had no idea what to eat. Like, how do you even dress? Like, what does that even mean? And so I really felt like I had a community of friends and peer mentors who walked me through it. And so I, it's so hard to know what to do, especially back then. There wasn't all this information out on the internet, or, like a little more transparency in how this works. You really, I felt like, didn't know unless someone could, support you along the way, a friend, a peer, a mentor. And I had really kind people that were willing to kind of like sit me down and answer all the, questions I had, and look at my essays and tell me what does a grad school interview even look like. And so on the other side now, some of my colleagues and I felt like we really wanted to dispel a lot of the mystery around this sort of stuff. And we created this free column in Science Careers called Letters to Young Scientists, where we wrote these kind of, about quarterly columns that just like put all this, to kind of demystified this, like, how do you put a CV together? We have a column on that. How do you interview for grad school? How do you give a research talk? Like, what does that mean, et cetera? Because we really felt like we didn't want this kind of information to only be available to those who were fortunate enough to have someone who was going to help them out. So we've been trying to kind of make this more publicly available, because it really shouldn't just be happenstance,
And where can they find that information?
Yeah, you can just Google Science Careers, Letters to Young Scientists, and it's a column. I'm happy to share the link too, but it's completely freely available. But yeah,
Great. Yeah. So you end up going to UC Berkeley for your PhD, right?
Yeah, I applied to a lot of places. But really, I was so happy where I was. I had really great mentors. I was really excited also doing some work with Dr. Keltner on positive emotions, and really felt like I was at home. And I interviewed, and there's wonderful programs out there. And what I was really looking for were places that were exactly like where I already was. So
Right.
I didn't expect to get in. And so I felt really surprised and happy when I found out I got in at Berkeley in their clinical program. And it was wonderful because I could just hit the ground running, right away.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I got to stay near my family, which was really important for me too, in the Bay Area through that time in my life. And just I loved this. I love the psychology department there. I just was visiting a few days ago, and it's like my other home,
And then you get a PhD, and then it's time to go on market, right? And so you end up where?
I ended up at Yale. And it was, I applied all over. I had a partner who was also applying for jobs. So we were applying all over together, trying to match up. And I was really lucky to start my career at Yale. It was a really exciting place. And I'd never lived on the East Coast. So that was kind of a new adventure and chapter. And I got to meet a lot of really great people. I have, positive memories of it. At the same time, I was doing long distance with my partner who is in Australia. And, you've got to find that balance that works for you with work and family and where we wanted to raise our family and be together. So we ended up, a handful of years later, finding our home and careers together in Boulder, Colorado, where our children have been born. And
wow.
Yeah.
Such a challenging thing for folks in your position. Yeah. And such a gift when you find it, right? So, and then you bring the lab with you to Boulder, and it's such a cool story. So, this is a teaching of psychology podcast. When I first met you, it was through Coast to Coast, Intro-Psych Coast to Coast, which is an online conference for teachers of psychology. And so thanks for, by the way, giving that keynote talk. It was great. And like the common person is, well, there's a couple of common people, but one of them is our friend Dave Myers, who is very close to so many people in this community, who has done so much for teachers of psychology nationally and beyond, and who I consider a dear friend. Can you just tell me, how did you meet Dave? Or maybe we should say this way: how did Dave meet you?
Oh, Dave is the best. I'm definitely in the Dave Myers fan club, like so many others. I remember the moment like very vividly when I first got connected with Dave. He reached out and sent me an email, and in his very kind, generous, warm way, opened a conversation about how he and Nathan DeWall, were working on the kind of next editions of their wonderful, Intro to Psychology textbook series, and kind of opened the possibility that they might be looking for someone to join their team. And did I know anyone? And I responded saying, well, it's so lovely to hear from you. And I might be interested. Would you be interested? And that was just the beginning of like wonderful conversations with Dave, getting to know him as a person. I've been able to meet his wife and see his home just on one of the islands outside of Seattle, his home also near Hope College. And he's just the best. He immediately kind of also took me under his wing and brought me into the Macmillan family, and has from day one been, sharing his, words of wisdom on writing and teaching. And really, he's amazing at building community. So I've been lucky.
I think if anybody knows your background, kind of positive emotions, so positive psych and emotions, it doesn't surprise them that this is probably a good match for, even though you come from different backgrounds, right? And I imagine that when you bring on a new co-author to a title, that you do want some different expertise. And so your clinical expertise is, I'm sure, super valuable. How have you been feeling about kind of contributing? I'm guessing you're in the writing process right now, but how how is it to contribute on on chapters that you are not maybe trained in?
I've loved it. Part of why I've loved teaching previously, like courses on introduction to emotion, is that they're so interdisciplinary. You're looking at the biology of feelings or clinical perspective, developmental. I've always loved the breadth. And so for me, I love teaching. I love having a broad range of information and awareness of the field. So for me, it was like a dream come true. And one of my favorite things that I've loved in psychology is the writing part. Everyone has the piece they love, and for me, it's always been the writing that I've really just thrived in and loved. So having the opportunity to kind of like reach outside and expand and think about what are the things that if I were a student, I would want to know and that I would want to take home and apply to my life. It's been so much fun. We've, worked on, a couple different textbook editions already, and it's just been great. And it's been an awesome team. And all of us are always reading everyone's writing. So everything you see, it's all three of us have gone through different, very in-depth, edits and revisions and conversations. So it's been
amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you ever saw yourself being an introductory psychology textbook author. Maybe you always did. Yeah. Did you?
I mean, I always knew I wanted to write for a broader audience and communicate, and I've communicate psychological science. You never know exactly where it's going to take you, though. But this has felt like just right. Perfect.
Oh,
really.
man. Well,
Yeah.
hey, I know that you've got a heart out here, and I just want to say it has been such a pleasure to sit down and have this conversation. I have a feeling we'll be running into each other at some point in the future. And so, but I do want to just thank you again for your generosity to this teaching of psychology community. I know that people are really going to enjoy what you bring. And actually now they know, because they know you in this conversation a little bit better too. So thanks for your time, June. And I just want to wish you all the best.
Oh, thanks, Garth, for having me. This is so fun. I'm really excited to keep chatting and running into each other too.